Well, good day to all of our viewers here on Entrepreneur Australia and via other mediums. I'm absolutely thrilled to be sitting here chatting today to Dr. Clem Sunter, who I've personally known for many years. I've had the privilege of knowing Clem and his family for many, many years. And as a young person back in the 80s, I sat in the audience and I listened with awe at Clem's presentations about the future of South Africa. And I think it's a treat that you're with us today, Clem. Thank you so much for making the time. It's 6 hours behind us. It's 5 o'clock here in Perth time, so about midday, I guess, in Cape Town, where you are. Lovely Cape Town. Just an introduction to you, Clem, because I think it's very important that we do share who you are, your very illustrious and well-achieved background, so that we have a sense of really the value that you bring to us today. So if I may, I'd like to just share a bit with our audience. After studying politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford University, Clem was recruited to Anglo-American in London in 1966. He moved to South Africa in 1973 and spent much of his subsequent career in the gold division of Anglo-American, serving as its chairman and CEO from 1990 to 1996. At that time, it was the largest gold producer in the world. He also established a scenario planning function in the company in the early 1980s, which led to 2 scenarios being put forward for South Africa in the 1990s, which I remember extremely well. The one scenario was the high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement, and then the other scenario, the low road of confrontation leading to civil war and wasteland. In essence, you sketched 2 very distinct scenarios, and I think in essence were very successful in influencing a positive path forward for South Africa, if I might say. So needless to say, South Africa took the high road. And 2 highlights for Clem were a presentation that he made to the then President F.W. de Klerk and the cabinet in 1986, and a visit to Nelson Mandela in prison to discuss the future just before his release. He has authored several best-selling books on scenario planning, one of which was The Mind of the Fox with Chantal Ilbery, published in June 2001, and it contained a letter to the then American president warning him that his biggest threat was a massive terrorist strike on the Western city. 9/11 happened just 3 months later. In 2004, Clem was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Cape Town for his work in the field of scenario planning. He was also voted by leading South African CEOs as the speaker who has made the most significant contribution to and impact on best practice and business in South Africa. Clem lectures at Harvard Business School in Boston and the Central Party School in Beijing. Is married to Margaret and has a daughter and 2 sons. So Clem, thank you very, very much. In my humble opinion, I believe that you are one of the leading global scenario planners of today. And I know that you are sought after by leading organizations, government bodies and the like all over the world. So for you to be giving us your time is really a privilege and an honor. Thank you so much. Clem, can I... Thank you. I know you're going to launch into a presentation that you've been doing globally, but I'd like to just set the scene from our side, my side, by asking you a few questions and asking you to weave those into your presentation, into your message today. If you can sort of shed some light on the history of scenario planning and why it is such an important management tool at the moment, as clearly no one can really predict where the world will be in the next few years. I'd like you to list various scenarios that could change the course of history, including the pandemic that we're currently experiencing, and what's brought that about and how does the future look in terms of this pandemic. How is the coronavirus expected to impact the world? How is it currently impacting the world? And what's the possible impact on the economies moving forward? And what role is entrepreneurialism going to play in the future? And how can entrepreneurialism be part of the solution? And then the final question that I'd like you to shed light on, because I know that you follow politics and global affairs very, very closely, is what can we expect in the run-up to the US election? I'd like you to sort of look into your crystal ball and tell us who's going to win the election, and what does the world and America look like post the election. And on that, I'm going to hand over to you, and I'm going to sit here and listen attentively and make a couple of notes and hopefully ask a couple of educated questions at the end of your presentation. Thank you, Clem. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Doug. My story really begins in 1960 with a book written by Herman Kahn. It was called On Thermonuclear War. It was published in the US because he worked for the RAND Corporation in California, which advises the American Defense Force. And it was the first time that a book had used this process called scenario planning. So he didn't try and forecast a nuclear confrontation between Russia and America. He basically wanted to describe what it would look like. And he used the word scenario because he had quite a few friends in Hollywood who used this word to describe the summary of a film script. And he thought it was a nice word to attach to planning, to say that if you want to plan for the future, you should write good stories about the future. And in this book, he conclusively showed that you needed a second strike capability on both sides to bring down the probability of a nuclear war. If you nuke me, I'll nuke you, so let's be sensible and not nuke each other. And it therefore resulted in a massive change in military strategy, despite just being a story about a possible war. 2 years later, after the popularity of this book, he wrote another one called Thinking the Unthinkable, which brings to mind one very key point about scenario planning, which is that you can imagine very extreme futures, which you can't do with a forecast or a formal projection, but you can imagine them in a scenario. In fact, we talk about known unknowns and unknown unknowns, things you know you don't know, and things you don't know you don't know. And certainly scenario planning means that you can reduce that list of unknown unknowns. After the success of the two books, he opened his own institute, and it was called the Hudson Institute. And one of his first students was my mentor, a Frenchman called Pierre Wack, who was absolutely brilliant. He came top of his class at l'École Polytechnique in Paris. He then went and studied under an Indian ashram, and then he went and was trained by Herman. And he thought, why not use this technique in a commercial setting as opposed to a military setting? So after he left Herman, he joined Royal Dutch Shell in France and then moved to London and set up a scenario planning unit there with a very gifted man called Ted Newland. And they collected a circle of remarkable people around the world to help them. And during the turbulent 1970s, he captured both oil price shocks in scenarios. The first time when it went from $3 to $12 a barrel, and the second time when it went from $12 to $36 a barrel. And while Shell management didn't do much about the first set of scenarios, they did invest in the second set. They made a lot of money. Pierre became a legend in London, and it came to our attention as Anglo-American, which at the time was the largest mining company in the world. And so we invited him to come to South Africa to give a presentation to our executive committee in the early 80s. I was the secretary of that committee at the time. And Pierre arrived He looked like a futurist. He had a goatee beard, he had hooded eyes. But what really got to us was before he spoke, he said, "Can I light up?" And we thought he was going to light a Gauloise cigarette, being French, instead of which he produced 2 incense sticks and lit them and played them under his nostrils, saying, "I think more clearly about the future if I'm smelling incense." So he then gave his lecture. We were all blown away. And Gavin Verley, who was our chairman at the time, looked around the room, his eyes alighted on me and said, "Clem, in addition to your normal mining responsibilities, would you please look after scenario planning?" And it was wonderful. It was such a privilege working with this man, Pierre Wack, Ted Newland, and all the other remarkable futurists that he had assembled around the world. And we did as a job in the sort of mid-80s, we completed a whole project on looking at global and South African scenarios in the 1990s. We called it The World and South Africa in the 1990s. And in the global scenarios, we had one which really came true, quite surprisingly. We called it Imperial Twilight. It was a scenario in which the arms race bankrupted the Soviet Union to the point that the Soviet Union disappeared at the end of the decade, which it did, which was a very crucial condition for South Africa to go into negotiation, because during the 80s, there was still the fear of Reds under your beds, that if the government ceded power to another group, we might end up as a Soviet vassal state at the bottom tip of Africa. And so it was a critical door that opened at the beginning of the 1990s. And as Doug said in his introduction, the scenarios we offered South Africans were the high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement and the low road of confrontation leading to civil war and a wasteland. And I remember doing presentations to the public in 1985 and 86, and they just thought this was a fairy tale. They said, "How could Anglo send somebody like you on the road, pay you to spin a fairy tale?" But it wasn't a fairy tale. It actually came true sooner than our own team had anticipated. We thought the mid-90s before people got serious about negotiation. But it happened in the late 80s. And then, of course, Nelson Mandela was released in February 1990, and the rest is history. So it, again, was a lovely case of introducing the unthinkable into the conversation.
Can I jump in? Sorry, I know I'm probably breaking your stride, but I can't miss this opportunity. From where I sat at that time, it really looked to me as though the scenario that you were sketching, the high road scenario, was one not so much talking about a hypothetical potential outcome, but that you were creating an outcome, an outcome by talking about and elaborating on that scenario. It's the old adage, if you talk about something enough, it can become a thing, can become a reality. Can you reflect on that?
Yes. You know, when people say, well, what was the contribution of your scenario exercise during the 1980s? My answer would be that we improved the conversation. We changed the conversation using the scenarios. It wasn't a question of us recommending that, you know, the key was negotiation. We offered people the alternatives, and that created a very lively conversation. And so, yes, in the end, the fact that we'd opened people's imagination made a small contribution to what actually happened. In the end, of course, it was very much the quality of the people involved, and particularly Nelson Mandela, that got a settlement. But scenario planning did what it was supposed to do, which was change people's minds, change the conversation. And indeed, Pierre Wack afterwards said it was probably the best example he could think of doing this, because he said he was used to changing the minds of the board of a company, whereas this was changing the minds of people in a nation. And so he was very happy with the consequences. Now, despite this success, when Pierre and his team retired, in about 93, 94, the whole process came to a halt inside my company, which was a major disappointment. And it was only in the year 2000 that I thought of a way of resuscitating it when I read a thesis by a remarkable young woman called Chantal Ilbury. She was doing an executive MBA at the Graduate School of Business in Cape Town. And her thesis was on how scenario planning could be adapted for small business and entrepreneurs by making it a more practical tool. And I said, Chantal, let's actually collaborate on a book together. And it took us 5 months to write, and we published it in June 2001, and we called it The Mind of a Fox. And we chose that title because we knew about a Greek poet called Archilochus, who said, the hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things. And then a famous book came out by Isaiah Berlin in the 1960s. He was an Oxford professor based on the hedgehog and the fox. And we just thought it was a superb metaphor for contrasting forecasting, the conventional technique that companies use for strategic plans, make a projection, against scenario planning. Because hedgehogs bet everything on a single forecast, whereas foxes are looking at multiple scenarios. They are judging the probability of those scenarios on a daily basis. They're looking at the flags, which would suggest that one or other scenario is in play. And then they make decisions. It's not that they change their decisions a lot. It's just that they're adaptable, they're flexible, much more flexible than hedgehogs. And we were very, very lucky because a few years later, America's top futurist, a man called Philip Tetlock, wrote a book where he examined the forecasts of 28,000 experts in the US to see how accurate they were. And they came to the conclusion, or he came to the conclusion, using exactly the same metaphor that we had of hedgehogs and foxes. He said that foxes were much better at capturing the future than hedgehogs. So it was wonderful to get that kind of support from another source. When the book first came out in June 2001, it wasn't that successful because books on scenario planning seldom are, but then something happened which turned it into an overnight hit. It was the best-selling book of any title in South Africa in 2002. And in 2003, it was number 2 because Harry Potter was number 1. So what was the event? As Doug said, it was 9/11, because what we decided in the book to show that this tool has real practical value was to include a formal letter to George Bush, "Dear Mr. President." And we said, your legacy will be determined by how much you behave like a fox with all the challenges you face as a president. And right now, your biggest threat is a massive terrorist strike on a Western city. We actually talked of a nuclear strike, but really it was the idea that it would be performed by terrorists. And it happened 3 months after we published the book. And when the Americans did a literature search, they found that ours was the only book published anywhere in the world that in a formal letter, so it wasn't fiction like other books had, this was a formal notification that the threat of a major terrorist strike was rising. Why do I know this? Because several months later, I was rung up by the State Department and asked, how do 2 South Africans capture an event like this when no American intelligence agency did? And I said, it's not because we actually knew that it was going to happen in New York, that it was going to be planes flying into buildings, and it would happen so soon after we published the book. You need inside knowledge for that. I said, we had 3 flags which suggested the probability of this event was rising. The first flag was the growing confrontation between the major religions of the world, which began in the late 80s and intensified during the 1990s. The second flag was the growing sophistication of terrorist movements in their strategy and tactics during the 1990s. But the event that convinced us that this was now a real possibility was the two attacks by Al-Qaeda on American embassies in Africa, one in Tanzania and the other in Kenya in 1998, which we felt was a dress rehearsal for the real thing in America. And we've always thought that if we'd been allowed to make our presentation to, say, the security agencies in America before 9/11 happened, they might have picked up on the much more specific flags that they got prior to the event. It came out in the congressional inquiry after 9/11 that there was a young woman in the FBI who went to her boss on 6 occasions and said, "Boss, there's a flying school down the road where Arabs are learning to take off but not land." Now that is a clue. And unfortunately, it wasn't followed up, and 2 of the suicide pilots actually went to that school. So we couldn't have had our methodology verified in a more dramatic form than that. As Pierre said, he said 2 things to me, which have always stood in good stead. Number 1, he said, it's much better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. So scenario planning isn't about super forecasting an event on a particular date. It's about getting the general trend right so that you can examine the more precise clues that it could really be happening. And the second thing he said is, if you want to look at the future, you've got to look at those elements in the present that are changing the game into the future. It's not that you have, prophetic qualities of jumping ahead. It's about a really smart analysis of what is happening at this time. So since then, we've been doing sessions all around the world. We became very popular in America for a time. We've done sessions all around the world using this technique of looking at the flags that are going up, changing the game. We consider the scenarios coming out of those flags by looking at the sort of causal links, causal chains that are flowing out of the flags. We then obviously say, well, what are you going to do about it? What are your options? And then obviously we ask them to prioritize options to make decisions. One of the most interesting examples for me was in 2006 in April. I was invited to go to the Central Party School, which is the inner sanctum of the Chinese Communist Party, to show them how this technique worked so that they could road test the 5-year economic plans that China has. And I spent the time showing them the methodology, but then I said, let's do a real exercise. What is it that concerns you most? And at the time they had $1.5 trillion worth of US bonds. And so they said, what concerns us, obviously, is a US recession. So we actually wrote a scenario of a US recession. Remember, 2006, we wrote this. And then I said in the afternoon, what is the flag that would suggest that this scenario will come into play? And they went into a huddle and they said, afterwards, we think it could be property prices, because the principal asset of an American consumer is his or her house. And if it goes down in value, that consumer will spend less. And since consumer spending is 2/3 of the American economy, that could well lead to a recession. So we chose an index, which was called the Case-Shiller Index, which measure property prices across America. And we all started watching it. And in the last quarter of 2006, the index topped out, having gone up for 20 years. And then in the first quarter of 2007, it fell 3 months in a row. So we were giving a 50% probability to a recession in America by March 2007. And then it fell for the next 3 months, and we upped it to 80%. And then, of course, the markets themselves, like the Dow Jones, started falling in September 2007. And then we obviously had the disappearance of Lehman Brothers in September 2008, confirming that we were in an even worse scenario than the recession. It was a financial crash. But again, it just showed that using this kind of technique gives you much more foresight than trying to predict what is going to happen in the future. So what are the flags now which our clients locally and internationally have raised with us, which were influencing the way the future moves before the pandemic actually struck? The first flag is the religious flag. It's still there, fluttering in the breeze, but it has changed in nature. There's still a risk of terrorist attacks in Western cities, but where one has to watch now is the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two sort of most powerful nations in the Middle East, because between them are the Straits of Hormuz, where a large quantity of the world's oil moves. And obviously, if they came into open hostility, that would have a massive impact on the oil price. And yeah, I mean, last year, the Saudi oil facilities were attacked. We had the assassination in a drone attack of a very senior Iranian general. And so you watch it on a daily basis saying, is the probability increasing of some kind of real conflict? And that's the best you can do. The second flag raised by our clients is we call the red flag, because it's the old communist world of Russia, China, and North Korea. Russia is very interesting. I mean, we just had another possibility of a poisoning of a very senior opposition leader. And the West has sanctions on Russia. Both Europe and America has sanctions on Russia because of the annexation of Crimea. And yet Europe gets 25% of its energy needs from Russia. So for a European company, this is a very critical flag to watch as to whether relationships are improving or not. I have to say, I think that the probability of a nuclear confrontation between America and Russia has declined, because we're now in the age of smartphones where leaders can get in touch with each other very quickly in the event of some emergency, in a way that in the early 60s, when you had the Bay of, in Cuba, you had the missile crisis, and Russia and America very nearly came to blows, you didn't have that level of communication. So I think it's less probable that a war is going to break out, particularly because of the second strike capability that each nation has, but it obviously has to be watched. China is probably the most important flag of all, and what its relationship with America is, because China has gone from being the 100th ranked economy in the world in 1978 to number 2 today, and it's closing in on America, and will probably overtake America to become the largest economy in the world somewhere between 2035 and 2040. And this is an enormous flag for people in the world, because it will be the first time that the East has dominated the global economy in, say, 400 years. Because you had various European countries in the 1700s, you had the UK during the 1800s, you had America in the last century, and this time it's going to be China, and that's going to change the game hugely. And you've got two nations with extraordinarily different cultures, America being a democracy and China being a one-party very, very, very controlled state. You've got this huge difference between the two. And yeah, it's going to be difficult. And you can see it at the moment. Before the pandemic struck, you know, there was already a trade spat going on. And during the pandemic, Trump is trying to keep America ahead by, banning things like WeChat and TikTok and going for China in the one area that America has had huge dominance, which is high-tech stocks like Amazon and Google and Facebook and Twitter and others. Now China is actually coming up with stuff that even America hasn't got in 5G. And so this is a very big moment for companies, particularly ones that trade internationally, to decide, how they are going to export whatever they produce. So big flag, China. The third one is North Korea. Despite all the photo opportunities between Trump and Kim Jong-un, and the shaking of hands and smiles, nothing has happened. I mean, North Korea has still got 46 nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a lot. They've stopped the missile tests, but they proved prior to ending them that they could actually reach the west coast of America with their latest missiles. Nothing's gone away. The American trade sanctions are still fully operational against North Korea, so there's no decrease in tensions. And of course, we now have the rumors that Kim Jong-un is really sick. We don't know whether they are true, but it just means that you've got to watch this, because if anything happens between North Korea and South Korea, it can affect the whole region. Very, very important flag to watch. The third flag is an interesting one, because it comes up time and again when we do work for the big banks, for investment companies, for provident funds. We call it the gray flag. And it's the aging of the world's population. It's a clockwork flag. It's ticking away in the background. It's not like, for example, the North Korean flag, which is a cloudy flag which can go in any direction. There's a whole level of randomness about the North Korean flag. But with this gray flag, it's precise, and it's ticking away, and it's changing the world. Pierre Wack himself said in 1988 that if China ever has a property crash, its economy will never grow fast again. And that was a huge statement to make, because we all believed that Japan was the nation to follow. And in 1990, they had a property crash, and their economy has never grown faster than maybe 1% per annum, compared to 7 or 8% in the 70s and 80s. And the reason Pierre said is because it's the oldest nation on earth. It has more people over 65 than anyone else's. Population is declining. And you cannot have a fast-growing economy in these conditions. And the level of innovation is going to fall. And. It's not that Japan becomes a dismal society because they have a very low unemployment rate. They have a very low level of inequality between their citizens. It's not that. It's just that the economy is pretty flat. Now, why is this important? It's because Europe is going exactly the same way. It's aging. Greece is the oldest nation in Europe. Italy has a declining population. And so this means, as Pierre would say, that Europe is not going to grow fast again. When you try and close the cone of uncertainty in terms of your scenarios with a flag, it's basically saying there is no scenario where Europe is going to suddenly go back to 5 to 6% economic growth. And the same is true of the UK. And that's why the national health in the UK is always under stress, because so many of the beds are taken by old people in the hospitals. And you just look at one statistic, which is the stock markets. In Britain, on December the 31st, 1999, so we're talking 20 years ago, 99, the FTSE 100 was 6,950. You know where it was this morning? 6,000, or maybe 6,100. So in 20 years, the FTSE has fallen by 10%. Now, what financial planner would have told you in 1999 that if you invest in the UK, you're going to lose money in terms of your capital in the next 20 years because of this flag? But it's happened. Yes, you've made the money out of dividends, and because it's been a 3% dividend yield, you could have doubled your money by reinvesting in dividends, but you'd have made no capital gain. In America, which is a younger population, a more resilient population, the Dow Jones Industrial Average at the end of the last century was 11,400. What is it? Yesterday, somewhere between 27 and 28,000. So it's more than doubled. Yes. And so this is a critical flag in terms of deciding where you're going to invest. And obviously, You can invest in other countries in the world which have younger populations, like Africa or South America, but you've got to watch out for other flags like quality of government and corruption and all those kind of things.
Yes.
Interestingly, China, its economy is slowing down because of the one-child policy that it had for so many years, which has turned it into a middle-aged nation with fewer younger people. And they've changed it back to a two-child policy, but it isn't going to stop the Chinese economy from slowing down. The fourth flag that we talk about is the anti-establishment flag. It is by far the most dramatic flag in our portfolio. It really went up in 2012, and a very good book was written at that time by a guy called Thomas Piketty. He's a French economist, and he called it Capital in the 21st Century, where he showed that the level of inequality in 2012 was virtually where it was in 1912. In 100 years, there had been no decrease in inequality. And he said it was because you had the First World War, the Second World War, which reduced the wealth of the super rich. You then had very universal economic growth in the 60s and 70s, which meant that everybody was uplifted. And then from the 80s onwards, the return on capital has been higher than the increase in salaries and wages. And obviously with the financial crash, nobody since the financial crash who's just based on salaries and wages has done that particularly well. In fact, many people would say they're worse off in real terms now than they were in 2007. And Piketty said this is going to invoke a rage amongst ordinary citizens, and the dynamics of politics is going to be changed. And so he was totally right to identify that flag because it produced Trump. I mean, Trump was very clever. He was a very rich guy, but he appealed to the blue-collar America, and he won the election in those key states. Boris Johnson, old Etonian, part of the upper snooty class in the UK, but he went up north of England and said, I think we should leave Europe, and you should vote for me because I don't believe in the political establishment in Westminster who think that we should stay in Europe. And it worked. And so it's a very powerful tool. Populist leaders in Europe are using it right now by saying we don't want any more illegal immigrants in our country. We're going to have to stop them from coming into our countries. And of course, it's led to all these movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too. You know, social movements now can be incredibly powerful because there's a level of unhappiness and instability which simply didn't exist 50 years ago. But what it's also done is it's created a gilded cage mentality amongst the rich old millions who live in developed countries that, you know, they want to put a cage over themselves so that the poor young billions can't get in. And this goes clean against globalization, which was the force that drove the last century after the Second World War to try and stop people going to war again. But now freedom of movement of people and goods and money and other things is under threat because of this whole gilded cage mentality. But the true irony is that within each of these gilded cages, the divisions are as big as ever. In America, I don't think I've come across a time when the Republicans and the Democrats hate each other more than they do at the moment. They simply won't cooperate. So, you know, this flag actually is creating divisions inside the cage, as well as between the people who live in the cage and outside the cage.
It's an extremely high risk sort of approach to take, the anti-establishment approach, Clem, because the likes of Trump, the Brazilian president, Boris Johnson and others are capitalizing on that to their own sort of ends, for their own purposes, but yet creating division, creating destabilization, creating a distrust in the establishments and bodies that actually need to be trusted, i.e. the FBI and others.
Absolutely. It has created this. And, you know, you've got movements saying defund the police in America. And you know, it's terrible, this, because, you know, we need law and order. And so, you know, it's just led to some very violent debates about things which we kind of accepted were part of a decent society in the last century. And I have to say that it's had absolutely no effect on levels of inequality. In fact, this pandemic has led to an even higher level of pandemic, as the you know, the FANG companies in America, the Facebooks and Amazons and Apples have done incredibly well, and Apple is now worth more than $2 trillion. And then against that, you've got the misery of all those restaurants that have had to close down because of the lockdown, and ordinary people out of work. So, you know, this particular flag has probably been intensified by the pandemic. And it's one that politicians have to watch out for, because, you know, it's a cloudy flag. One simply doesn't know which way it's going to go. The next flag is an interesting one, because it's the one when I do presentations to young children. It comes out as probably their most important flag. It's the green flag of climate change. And I did a session at a school the other day where one young girl sitting across from me said, "The problem is, Clem, your generation doesn't see the significance of this flag. And you know why? Because you'll be dead by the time that it really becomes toxic for us." And that's why you've got Greta Thunberg and you've got these other young people, because actually it is turning into a huge flag. And I have to say, when I wrote a book in 2015 called Flag Watching, where I went into these particular flags. In fact, it's available on Amazon. You can get it. Flag Watching. I said in that book that one of the problems with this particular flag is that it's going to create extreme weather patterns and extreme weather events like fires and droughts and things like that. And boy, oh boy, are we seeing this. I mean, California right now has got another blaze. It was so sad that Australia had those terrible fires around Sydney and south. It is a huge flag that is affecting us, but we don't see it because it's slow. You know, we're used to threats right in our face, fight or flight. But this is a slow threat. The sea levels are rising because, I don't know, 30 trillion tons of ice has actually melted in the last 30 years. And so sea levels are gradually rising, and ultimately they're going to affect coastal cities and islands like the Marshall Islands and other oceanic islands. So, you know, it is a flag, and it's not just the climate, it's the fact there's a sixth extinction of species going on, because, you know, we're 7.5 to 8 billion people in the world, and we're displacing other species as we expand our own numbers. So it's probably the most influential flag of all, because it has to do with the future of our planet. But we are still putting economic development, growth and everything, material prosperity, ahead of this flag. But young people are beginning to see its true significance. I mean, I did a session in South Australia, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, with some of the major players in Adelaide, including a representative from the Premier's office. And one of the things that we looked at was the fact that the Murray River is actually getting smaller. The number of cubic meters of water flowing into the state is falling because Central Australia is getting hotter. And then you've got to have smarter irrigation techniques. You've got to have smarter everything in terms of using water faced with these particular conditions. And I think they've got a special faculty now at the University of Adelaide to handle this. So it's a really, really important flag. That's not just for the kids, but the adults at the moment, and particularly Trump, has just ignored it. You know, he pulled out of the Paris Accord. You know, we still got great problems with this particular flag. The next one that has come up for a long time is the national debt flag, and it really was due to the easy money that became available after the great crash of 2008. And the critical statistic to look at on this flag is the national debt to GDP ratio of countries. And it's very significant that with this new infusion of cash into the global economy, some people talk about $10 trillion around the world being put in for relief measures by governments everywhere. It's meant that America's GDP, for the first time since 1942, is over 100% of GDP. I know that Italy's been over 100% for a long time. Japan's been over 100% for a long time. But boy, America's just gone through this, and Britain is around about 90%. And yes, we've got zero interest rates in order to accommodate this. But if indeed this whole infusion of cash leads to higher inflation rates, and may perish the thought, hyperinflation, then interest rates are going to have to rise again. And then government's going to find it difficult to actually service their debt. And then you could have defaults. So it's obviously a financial flag that, again, one is going to have to watch on a daily basis. But the last flag is absolutely covered in flag watching. I devoted at least 2 pages to it. It's the pandemic flag. I basically said every century has its pandemic of one kind or another. I went back to the Black Death, which killed 30% of the European population around about 1346 to 53. A quarter of London's population died in 1665 through the Great Plague before the Great Fire of London terminated it. 100 years ago, we had the Spanish flu, which killed nearly 50 to 100 million people. And before this particular pandemic, we had HIV/AIDS, which has killed 40 million people, and there are somewhere between 35 and 40 million people actually living with HIV at the moment. And guess what? There is no vaccine yet for HIV. So what I said in the pandemic flag section, I said this is highly probable as something which could change this century. We have more frequent international air travel, we have bigger cities, and now we have viruses jumping from animals to human beings, as was shown by SARS and MERS. The real unknown about this pandemic was the lockdown. And you've got to separate the two. Because the pandemic is one thing, and in fact, it's not been as serious as pandemics in previous century, but never, ever has the world gone into a complete lockdown. If I'd actually put that to you in November last year and said there's a scenario where you're not going to see a single person on any major city street in the world, all restaurants are going to be closed, all international sports gatherings are going to be cancelled, you'd have said, huh? This is unimaginable. But it happened. It happened. And so that's what the real surprise element in this pandemic has been. And it has produced 4 scenarios, which I've written up in 2 articles for South Africa's major internet news site, News 24. And I'd just like to go through those 4 particular scenarios. The first one is Much Ado About Nothing. Good Shakespearean title. And it's one, obviously, that Trump adheres to. He's never given much significance to this pandemic. He wants to get out of it as soon as he can. He says it's going to go away. And of course, there have been a whole bunch of conservative commentators and even experts who've backed him on this one. And I have to say, in a sense, the markets agree with Trump. If you look at the Australian market, look at American markets, British market, you know, the markets do believe that we're going to get out of this pretty quickly because they had a very bad March, but they've been gradually recovering since then. And, you know, you look at NASDAQ in America, the technical index is hitting record levels. But I discount the narrative of this particular scenario because you had the the sheer chaos in New York hospitals and in hospitals in the UK, which would never have been caused by common flu. I mean, common flu just didn't cause that level of havoc and chaos, and people not having the protective equipment, not having the ventilators and so forth and so on. So it is worse than common flu. But I have to admit that it is a widely held scenario. The second one, after much ado about nothing, I call camel's straw, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And I basically said that this scenario is based on the pandemic, not that being that serious, and it was before the lockdown. It's not going to be that serious, but the world was in a fragile state before the pandemic hit. And, you know, you didn't need very much disruption to force the world into a fairly long recession. And so the camel's straw is where the tough times that we're in last longer than people think, because a lot of the damage to the economy in terms of small business is still not fully accounted for in the statistics. In other words, yes, Wall Street has gone up, but Main Street is still in a pretty dismal state, and people are worried about how slowly it's coming out of the pandemic. So it's a scenario where, you know, we have economic tough times stretching well into next year. The third scenario is basically where the pandemic gets worse, and we call it Spain again. It's a repetition of the flu 100 years ago, where the second phase was actually worse than the first because the virus mutated into a more lethal form. I personally give a low probability to this scenario because experts aren't talking about the coronavirus like that. And in fact, some people are believing that it's mutating into a milder form. So yeah, that scenario is there, but I don't give it a major probability. The last one is the one that we're all in, and I wrote it up in April. I called it tightrope, walking the tightrope, where governments in the world would set out and balance on the tightrope with trying to protect lives on the one side and trying to revive livelihoods on the other side. And that's exactly where we are. Every government is doing this. And of course, as I said in the article, it's going to be a wobbly ride because, you know, you're going to have outbreaks, and then you've got to do something about it, like you have in Victoria, like the UK has in Manchester, and America has in some of the southern states. And then, you know, it's quite a messy walk along the tightrope. Of course, people are saying that a vaccine will get you to the other side very quickly, and yes, it will. And there's lots of companies around the world are now trying to develop vaccines. The Russians say they've already got one. But we'll have to wait and see. I mean, I guess most people agree that it could be next year before we have something that could be rolled out in billions of doses. And so, yeah, that is the one event that will get us to the other side. And we'll just have to wait and see. But this tightrope, this walking the tightrope, is something which all you can do is watch on a daily basis, see what happens to the economic statistics, what happens to the new cases, and see whether, in fact, the recovery is actually going as the markets are projecting, or whether it's going to be slower than we thought. So very important scenarios to watch. Which brings me on to one of the most important flags for everybody around the world in terms of an economic recovery, which is the changing nature of work. And again, I identified it in the book Flag Watching, which is that in the last century, big businesses were creating hundreds of thousands of jobs, which meant that if you were young in the 1960s, like I was in the UK, you just got your school certificate, you went to university if you were lucky, and got your degree, you then waved your CV in front of a big company, you got employed. Well, those days have gone because automation, robots, artificial intelligence, the fourth industrial revolution, as it's called, has destroyed so many jobs that for many young people, they have to create a job rather than get a job. And there's a huge difference between the two, because you need entrepreneurial skills to create a job rather than just sheer academic qualifications. But think about this. Has any school in the world tumbled to this, that you're educating kids for the future, not the market of the past, and they should be adapting their curriculum to this huge flag that is flying everywhere. I mean, look at America. America, before the pandemic struck, had an unemployment rate of 3.5%. Europe was somewhere between 6 and 10%. Why? Because Americans have always been more entrepreneurial. You go to middle America, people have 3 or 4 jobs. They do Uber, they work at Pizza Express, they do this, and that's how they survive. Because they're naturally more entrepreneurial than than Europeans. So, you know, it is such an important flag. And I'm saying here in South Africa, you know, this is a golden opportunity to make up for the whole mess caused by the pandemic, because there's no cash in the bank for the government and other things. We've got to have a kind of revolutionary model around uplifting small business and entrepreneurs in this country, where we integrate the township economies with the mainstream economy, and we create a completely different model. I mean, we have a fairly charismatic guy called Julius Malema here that I did a lecture with the other day, and he said, you know, I believe in economic freedom. And he wants to use economic freedom to nationalize the banks and the land and the mines. I said, yes, I'm an economic freedom fighter like you, Julius. It's just that I want to do something which allows ordinary people to have more economic freedom, which means we've got to do something about creating micro lending institutions. We're going to have to possibly set up stock markets in all our major cities so that any entrepreneur can put his business on the site and say, I'm offering 20% for X and getting crowdfunding for it. We should be saying to our big businesses, allocate 20% of your supply chain to nurturing new entrepreneurs. Indeed, my company, Anglo American, has a project called Zimeli, which does precisely that. We identify goods that can be made by small business that we use underground on our mines, and we've gone ahead and given them contracts, provided financial support, even directors and stuff like this, so that we can create this new type of economy, which is based on entrepreneurial spark. And if you think about it, why is America the #1 nation on earth? It's not because of all the presidents like Washington and Lincoln and all those people. It's because they produce the great entrepreneurs. People like Henry Ford, people like Walt Disney, more recently Bill Gates, and then Steve Jobs, whose father was Syrian, married an American woman. He was adopted by the Jobs family, and probably he's the single human being who's changed life on earth more than anybody else in the last 20 years. And now, of course, America has one of our own entrepreneurs, Elon Musk, educated at Pretoria Boys High. And that's why they are so successful. And I'm saying here in South Africa, but it applies equally in Australia, you've got to do the same thing. You've got to really, really provide a much more positive environment for young entrepreneurs to grow their businesses. So it is probably the key flag in terms of recovery of the economy. And the last point that Doug asked me to talk about was the US election and, you know, what impact it might have on the global economy. Well, the first thing I have to say is, isn't it amazing that being US president, there's a a minimum age qualification, which is 35. You have to be 35 years old to become American president, but there's no maximum age. We don't have a retirement age for the American president like you have with a company at 60 or 65. And so you have the two oldest candidates in the history of the US presidency vying to become president, 74, 79 years old. And, you know, for me, this is an incredible thing to think about, that here you have the commander-in-chief of the most powerful nation on earth with a finger which can press that nuclear button and all that kind of stuff. And you've got this kind of race between two guys who in normal business would be retired. I think that the race is closed. I mean, Biden was way ahead about a month ago, but the momentum recently has been with Trump. And so it's going to be very, very interesting to see. I think it's going to be a very close election. So as a scenario planner, I'm kind of in a 50-50 at the moment. Whereas I guess a month ago I was saying Biden is going to win. But there was a teeny flag that went up that yesterday or the day before at the Republican convention. Who's now positioning himself to be the president after the next 4 years? Donald Trump Jr. He wants to follow his father as president. So there is a scenario where you don't have 4 more years of Trump, you have 12 more years of Trump. So, you know, this is a very important flag to watch in America. But as for the global economy, as I said, we're actually in a very divisive mode at the moment between China and America. So I think, you know, our time's going to get easier after the pandemic is over. Is China going to make up to America? And, you know, China's got some terrible things going on, like the Uyghurs, the handling of the Uyghurs in China, this whole thing of the security laws in Hong Kong, what they might do with Taiwan, what's happening in the South China Sea. You know, these are all major concerns, and they're not going to go away when the pandemic is lifted. It's going to be, I think, a pretty tough global economy, because we're not going to have that sort of huge belief in globalization that we had in the last century to drive the economy forward. But I don't want to end on a negative note. That the companies that are smart, that are particularly into the digital age, and who can actually help companies with the change in behavior that will no doubt happen as a result of the pandemic, with more people working from home and other things. And of course, the normal businesses that you have providing restaurants and hotels and stuff like that, you know, there's still, obviously, you can have a very good future if you have a smart business run by foxes who watch the particular flags that are changing their particular markets, technology, legislation, consumer taste, whatever it is. What are the flags changing your market? What are the scenarios, particularly the unexpected scenarios? How can I, as a fox, take opportunities out of that, unexpected opportunity, or counter the threats? And then how can I be quicker? How can I be really agile in my strategy so that I'm ahead of my competitors? So please, I'm not saying that you can't make money in the economy when it really opens up after this pandemic, but you've got to be more like a fox. So I'll end with a blessing for all of you who've been listening to me. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Clem. That really was incredible. Thank you so much. I'll tell you what jumps out at me there is the need to be flexible, agile, the need to have a very, very, very clear handle on what's going on in the here and now, so that you can develop reasonable foresight into the future. I think I read it once somewhere that said that the best CEOs in the world have great strategic foresight. And as you alluded to just now, you can't have that foresight unless you actually are developing very clear insight into what's going on in your immediate sort of space and around the world that could impact on you. Now, the question I would like to ask you, Clem, is if just in a nutshell, a couple of sentences, as you know, people often believe that the world is dominated by large listed companies, when in fact, by number, the world is dominated by privately owned, family-owned businesses. And in fact, I think 89% of all businesses in the US are family-owned. And their challenges are very real every day. They've got to get up, they've got to listen to the news and see what's going on in the US and other parts of the world, a very uncertain geopolitical environment, et cetera, What's your message to them? What would you be saying to the small to medium business owner right now?
Well, one of the points I make here is when I talked of the tightrope scenario for governments, I said it applies to you in business, and it obviously applies to you as a human being looking after a family. You're walking the tightrope in terms of balancing risk of exposure to the virus against obviously opening up your business and making money again. So in the short term, this practice of balancing the two is very, very important to try and maximize the protection of your employees so that they don't catch the virus, but at the same time, obviously wanting to get your business up and running again. But as a fox, you've got to say to yourself, what is it that I learned from this pandemic? I mean, I actually think a lot more people are going to work from home. I've done a lot of work for companies where they think that quite a large chunk of their workforce, particularly if they work in a head office situation as opposed to in an operating plant, are going to work from home. It's more economical for them to do so, and they've actually established digital networks which allow them to work very effectively from home. So, as a small business, family business, I'd be saying, what are the kind of, long-term impacts on my business as a result of this pandemic? How can I walk the tightrope effectively between getting my business running again, but obviously trying to protect my staff? And then in the longer run, obviously it goes back to the old story of what is it that I can do which is different to the big guys and be more personalized and stuff like that. Because there is a huge opening for small business around the world, despite the success of the giants. And one of the points I always make is the giants of today are never the giants of tomorrow. You look back to the 60s and the giants of General Motors and General Electric and so forth and so on. Then you had Microsoft, and yes, it's still a giant, but we're now focusing on Amazon and Apple and so forth. And in 30 years' time, it'll be somebody else who will all be focusing on. So some of those small family businesses or small businesses will actually turn out to be the next giants. And that's what's so great about being an entrepreneur, is that you actually don't know where your destiny is going to lead you until it actually happens.
I get to work with, I'm lucky to work with, have been lucky to work with hundreds of small businesses over the years. And one of the things I say to them is that you have to work through what I call a few strategic questions. The one is the what if, which I suppose ties in with your scenario planning. What if this happens? What if that happens? The next question is, so what if it happens? And the third question is, or point to be made is, if it happens, I will do this or that so that I can and then finish the sentence. So it's really a case of considering the various scenarios that you are confronted with, trying to work through them, applying a balance of probabilities to the various scenarios, and then bringing that home to your own business or circumstances. And then I sort of pick up on the word you raised there, and that is risk. Far too few businesses that I deal with think about risk carefully and clearly enough. So all of these various scenarios can bring potential upside, but can bring significant downside. And what will the business owner do in the event that they eventuate an impact on their business? What's the mitigation measure? How do they deal with the risk? Do you think that should be built into your scenario thinking and planning?
Yeah, I mean, the really important point you made there was that, and it really came out with Chantel's work on scenario planning for small business, and as well as her contribution in The Mind of a Fox, is that you've got to work out what you will do if this happens, so that you're quicker in your response than if you hadn't thought it out at all and you go into a panic. Imagine if all those hospitals in London had actually worked through a kind of public health crisis and shortage of protective equipment and maybe ventilators before it actually happened. They would have had a much better response than what actually happened. And I mean, you're talking about, you know, very, very sophisticated people here who just didn't do that level of what if, and then work out, you know, what the most efficient and quickest response would be. And I feel particularly with small business, which right now their balance sheets must be under a lot of strain. You know, it'd be nice to have lots of cash and this and that, so that you don't have to worry about what will happen. But a lot of small businesses aren't in that position. And so you've got to actually work through those what ifs on risk. But obviously, one point about a fox, which was your second point, I think, is that you try and have a situation where you minimize the chances of risk, you know, turning you upside down, making you bankrupt, whatever it is, by having a strategy which is diverse, and which can therefore, you know, be resilient under most market scenarios. That's you know, a critical factor of trying to find that diverse strategy. But don't be too confident about it, and that's why you must play the kind of extreme what-if scenarios. As I said at the very beginning, the great thing about this process is that you have less unknown unknowns, things you don't know, because you know, you're supposed to explore them with stories.
I love that, Clem. Thank you so much. Clem, we've had a lot of your time, and I know that the viewers, those that have dialed into us, get to listen to this, will derive enormous benefit. So thank you very, very much. Please give my regards to Margaret, your lovely wife, whom I know very well. And hopefully we'll, you know, have the privilege of getting you back on to talk about possibly the post-Trump or post-US election era and how things are looking then. But until then, we'd be very grateful for your time. And we wish you all the best, Clem. Thank you.
Very much, Doug. I wish you all the best in your very crucial task of helping entrepreneurs in Australia. As I said, it is the really big part of the recovery process for Main Street, is to open up the economy for entrepreneurs. And as I said, the benediction that I can offer all of you, may the fox be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clem. Bye-bye. Have a good day.